Teyvat is a pretty weird place, isn't it? I mean, it's a continent and also a planet, but one with a near impossible structure. Like, the entire planet is covered by a protective barrier that's decorated with star-shaped rocks that mess with people's minds and also control fate. And then instead of a molten core at the center of the planet, there's somehow both an endless abyss and a whole country that has its own sun and moon and also access to the outside from inside the planet? Listen, not even a hollow planet theory can make this work properly. The structure is so fundamentally flawed and surreal that it could only exist within a dream. Which is actually what I want to talk about today. The possibility that Teyvat isn't a real place within the game at all, but instead a world woven from dreams. Now hold on before you get your knickers in a twist, because the protagonist woke up and it was all a dream trope is the most annoying cop-out fantasy ending ever. I think HoYoverse has put an interesting spin on this, because I think the goal of the game isn't to wake up from the dream. I think the goal and the purpose of the traveler's journey, and their role as a witness, is all leading up to a finale where the dream becomes reality. And I think I can prove it. And boy, oh boy, does this shed a lot of light on some of the bigger mysteries in the game, from Celestia's goals to the plight of the dragons to the true power of a descender. This theory will recontextualize a lot of things. I don't want to say everything, but a lot of things. But in order to make this case, I'm going to be borrowing some themes, philosophies, and mechanics from some other HoYoverse games. Not because I think the games are connected in any way, but because HoYoverse really loves this whole collective consciousness dream world setup, and they tend to reuse the foundational ideas and principles in every one of their titles. Most of the terminology I'm going to be borrowing from Star Rail, because not only is it the most recent iteration of this idea, but it's also the one that's been the most consistent and generous with its world-building explanations. Now, if you're still with me, you guys are in for a wild ride, so grab a seat and get comfy. Timestamps, spoiler warning, citations, attributions, and links for related content will be in the description box, while post-video notes and corrections can be found in the pinned comment, as always. Okay, let's start with the basics. Teyvat seems to be constructed primarily of elemental energy, at least according to this loading screen text. And yes, I could show you more examples digging into the exact details about how elemental energy directly affects the physicality of the world and the people within it, but in the interest of time, just roll with me here. The reason I bring this up is that having the world be made of elemental energy is exactly the same as having it be made up of memories. Why? Because elemental energy and memories are interchangeable with each other. You can kind of think of elemental energy as ice and memories as water. You can melt the ice to get the water or freeze the water to get the ice. Regardless, you're still going to be working with the same molecule. It's just in two different states. Now, I could also take this opportunity to go into a dozen examples on why this is really the case, but let's just do the easy thing for now and once again point to the scene with a Pep. A Pep is a dragon, and dragons are pure elemental beings and also Teyvat's original species, so in order to absorb her fragments, she has to convert all of their emotions, knowledge, and memories into pure elemental energy. In other words, she is transmuting the elements into memories. And we're actually very familiar with this process because we see it all the time, just in reverse. When we claim rewards from a petrified tree within domains, we offer the trees resin, which is raw, crystallized elemental energy. And in return, the tree gives us crystallized memories. That's what artifacts and these ascension materials really are. We do the same thing for boss fights, which are canonically instances of the traveler revisiting their own memories and claiming a crystallized form of them at the end of Battle from the Leyline Blossom. Now, if you wanted to change what kind of crystallized memory you got from a boss fight into a different crystallized memory, then you're gonna need something called a dream solvent. And it's in the description of this item that things start to get really interesting. Not only does it say that people believed in memories taking physical form at one point, but the dream solvent also says that it takes objects obtained from memories and converts them into, quote, some other dream. This allows us to make a direct connection between memories and dreams. And considering the fact that there are countless lines in and out of the game referencing dreams and stressing the importance of memories, there must be something to this idea. So what if we just assumed that Teyvat is a dream world built from memories? After all, we just got this name card, which has the most infuriating description that reads, "The dreams someone weaves into being are false, but they nonetheless point towards something real. There must be an eternity forged from memory at the end of this path." Which frankly just sums up the rest of this video. Although, I admit, this line is a little cryptic in how exactly it applies to Teyvat, so let's take a stab at decrypting its meaning by expanding our HoYoverse world-building lexicon. That should help us figure out how feasible this hypothesis really is. Okay, So Hoyoverse likes to split its worlds into two parts, the material world and the immaterial world. The material world, which I will call real space, is all about physical reality, the tangible everyday life that we experience, and the familiar laws of nature we observe like space-time, thermodynamics, and gravity. In the Hoyoverse, real space often gets conceptualized as a golden cosmic tree with star clusters at the tips of its branches that form galaxies possessing life, and this tree is said to be the, quote, manifestation of the will of the universe. On the other hand, the immaterial world, which I'm going to call the memory zone, cannot be as easily perceived as it's basically a chaotic, lawless realm where all of our memories, thoughts, and emotions reside. It's generally conceptualized as a sea of consciousness, full of a rather familiar-looking silver and pink-tinged liquid known as Memoria. At its most simplistic level, Memoria is just liquid memories, but it also has a ton of very curious properties that make it the cornerstone for this entire theory. Because despite being a fluid that only really exists in the mental dimension, which you shouldn't really be able to perceive, you can actually make stuff out of it. Monsters, people, or even entire worlds can be made out of Memoria, although they're only going to exist within the memory zone and not in real space. Worlds created from Memoria are called dreams and generally take the shape of a bubble. This is because the chaotic sea of consciousness that makes up the memory zone has no laws like time and space, which make it nearly impossible for a normal person to navigate. If you wanted to create a traversable reality within the chaos, you're going to need to isolate a set amount of Memoria from the rest of it via some kind of barrier. This allows you to establish control over a small bubbled space and create something more comprehensible and coherent than the lawless sea outside of the bubble. But just like a normal bubble, the bigger a dream world is, the more unstable and likely to pop it is. And that's bad news because the last thing you want is for all the chaotic, disordered memories outside of the bubble to come pouring into the bubble and mess up the precious order that you established. Now, the reason these bubble worlds are called dreams is because trying to control the memories distorts them, creating worlds that feel a bit surreal, like they obey a completely different set of natural laws. Now, does all of this sound kind of familiar? Because it should. Teyvat is a world surrounded by a dark sea with a firmament that's making up the sky, separating the order that Celestia has established from the disordered abyss on the other side, and it has its own laws. That sounds a lot like a bubbled dream floating in the sea of consciousness. So if Teyvat is made up of elemental energy, which is just memories in a different state, and memories are synonymous with dreams, and Memoria is just memory juice that can make up a whole dream world, then is it not realistic to assume that Teyvat is simply made of Memoria, or better yet, a Memoria-like substance? I think it is, but this substance goes by another name in Teyvat. I am, of course, talking about primordial seawater, and that is a claim that I will now proceed to back up with evidence. Let's get the obvious thing out of the way. Memoria looks like primordial seawater. Yes, the Memoria is slightly more blue, but it still has that very unique silvery pink tinge to it. And they're both weirdly connected to whales, of all things. And I'm not just talking about the narwhal that kept trying to drink the primordial sea, although it is odd that it's connected to black holes, and there was this black hole type thing that was trying to swallow Penacony's dream world and Star Whale, but also, it's odd because whales are directly connected to dragons. See, the Hebrew word for whale is Leviathan, which is where we get the word Leviathan from. And in Genshin, Neuvillette is the Leviathan, the biblical one. And he's also the heart of the Primordial Sea. And both the all-devouring narwhal and the whale-shaped bishop, Scylla, have spirit bodies made from primordial seawater. That on its own is more of a fun fact than proof of anything, but consider this. Teyvat's primordial sea is actually a reference to the primordial soup theory, a theory that describes a hypothetical set of conditions surrounding bodies of water on Earth that led to the development of early life. Not only does Neuvillette's character story say that all life in Teyvat can trace its origins back to the primordial sea, but this item calls it the primordial soup outright. So these primordial soup water bodies were thought to be filled with the building blocks of early life, which again is in line with the theory that all life on Teyvat originated from the primordial sea. Now, I'm intentionally using the term building blocks here because I want you to compare this to how Genshin describes elemental energy as being the building blocks of the physical world. This implies that elemental energy comes from the primordial sea. And I know that seems like a stretch right now, but stick with me while I lay out all the puzzle pieces. So we already established that elemental energy can be converted into memories, right? Well, the primordial sea has basically established itself as a sea of consciousness, because anyone who dissolves into the primordial sea doesn't disappear, but instead has their consciousness assimilated into it. It's very Memoria-like. Now, I know technically the primordial seawater only dissolves with people from Fontaine because they used to be oceanids that were remodeled into human shapes using the seawater, but thanks to Sigewinne's story quest, we can make a pretty strong case that the seawater's effectiveness depends on the degree of separation between it and the life form in question. For example, Fontainians used to dissolve because their forms were not complete, but as soon as Neuvillette turned the seawater in their veins into real blood, they no longer dissolved. Neuvillette added a degree of separation between the Fontainians and the Primordial Sea through transmutation. But in Sigewinne's quest, we learn of a Primordial Seawater derivative that can change someone's appearance. But it's most effective on Fontainians, likely because they're only 1 degree of separation away from the Primordial Sea, far enough to not dissolve, but close enough to be very sensitive to its effects. Now, what this tells us is that in order to be affected by the Primordial Seawater, you likely have to have a relationship with the Primordial Seawater. The closer this relationship is, the stronger its effects. And since Sigewinne's quest heavily implies that the face-changing potion made of the seawater can affect everybody, that means everybody at some point came from the Primordial Sea, or at least was made of a material like it. Because in the case of the Melazines, they were born from the flesh of Elenus, who would have been made from the Abyss. And you know how I referred to the Memoria surrounding the dream bubble as the Abyss earlier? How it was just an endless sea of chaotic, unprocessed, disordered Memoria? I'm applying that same logic here. So if primordial seawater is stable Memoria and unstable Memoria is like the Abyss, then the unstable primordial seawater must also be the Abyss. And that's probably why Sigewinne can generate source water droplets, same as Neuvillette, despite being the child of an abyssal dragon. The only other character to do this is the Traveler, who is arguably emulating the elemental dragons with their kit in every region. I've made the case for this in a couple of videos, which you can find linked downstairs. Now keep in mind that the heart of the primordial sea was a dragon, Neuvillette, which makes sense if the dragons are Teyvat's original species and life came from the sea that they govern. This carries on the aquatic themes of the Sea of Consciousness, which is probably why the dragon designs are all inspired by deep-sea aquatic life like sea slugs. Except for Aisha, but he gets a pass because he's representing a more amphibious side of things since he's a geo-dragon, which is like land, you know? Sealies also share this trait, incidentally, which could suggest that they are similar life forms, especially since they are directly affiliated with the moon, and therefore the moon sisters who governed Teyvat at one point in the far distant past. Now, moons are also associated with nighttime, which is associated with dreaming, which further helps solidify their connection with being native life forms to a dream world. But I am getting very distracted. To further solidify the connection between the Primordial Sea, Memoria, and the Abyss, consider the fact that dragons are somewhat compatible with forbidden knowledge, which is found in the depths of the Abyss, but they can only process it in small quantities. This makes sense only if dragons are made from ordered Memoria, and the Abyss is made from disordered Memoria, because it means that they can introduce small amounts of disorder into their systems and order it over time. Too much disorder will overtake the order, and that's how you get a sick dragon like a Pep. So potentially, the reason the Dragon King Nibelung decided that only forbidden knowledge could defeat the leader of Celestia, who we call the Primordial One, was because the Primordial One had established a new order within the dream, giving them complete control over Teyvat. And the only way to destabilize that control would be to introduce unstable elements from outside the dream. That unstable material was forbidden knowledge. Now, for those of you who are not keeping track, I have just made the claim that primordial seawater, the Abyss, forbidden knowledge, and elemental energy are all the same thing in different forms, and basically they all just equate to Memoria. And that's a pretty big claim, until you decide to look at it from an alchemical lens, which feels appropriate since, according to the Dust of Azoth, alchemy is a study of the nature of matter and the rules that underpin its transformations, and ultimately it seeks to comprehend the working principles of the world and the flow of the ley lines. And ley lines contain elemental energy, which I am claiming is the same thing as both Memoria and primordial seawater, which is, in theory anyway, what the entire world of Teyvat should be made from. And you know what that makes the primordial seawater and the Memoria? You know, like in alchemical terms? The prima materia. So the prima materia is basically like a source material for literally everything that has ever existed, not just life. It's often likened to the primordial chaos that's found in Genesis tales because this source material can be filtered, molded, transmuted, and manipulated into any kind of material or life form. Sound familiar? One thing about this that actually made me giggle comes from this quote on the Prima Materia wiki article that comes from the Theatrum Chemicum, which says that the prima material contains in itself all colors because in Genshin, the 7 elements are conflated with 7 different colors of light. You're starting to see why I think the elements themselves are derived from this stuff. It doesn't help that Memoria can be captured in a sliver of solidified light known as a light cone, especially when you remember that when it comes to physics, a light cone is a representation of the path that light takes through space-time. I am oversimplifying a little bit there, but this is only half the story. You remember how I started this video off by talking about both the memory zone and real space? And how the memory zone is like a sea of consciousness and how real space is like a big tree that represents the will of the universe? Well, to impose one's will on a world is to establish order. So in a small leap of logic, which I will justify in a bit, I would like to suggest that Irminsul, which is a tree, is the anchor that keeps things ordered within Teyvat's dream. Think about it. The job of the Loom of Fate is to weave ley lines, which directly links ley lines to fate, something I go into way more detail on in this video. But the current ley lines are the roots of Irminsul, which suggests that Irminsul is how Celestia dictates the fate of the world. In other words, Irminsul is mimicking the job of the golden tree from real space. It's imposing order within its domain, which in this case is the dream world of Teyvat. Because what is fate but absolute, inescapable order? Let's talk a bit about that big golden tree that represents real space for a bit. You remember how I said that tree has star clusters that form the leaves at the ends of its branches? Well, it's said that each leaf, each star, contains a fragment of the universe's will. Now, what does a traveler call themselves? A star. Now, it's irrelevant whether or not they are a star, but you can't deny that the traveler does a darn good job granting the wishes of the people of Teyvat and acting as a conduit for their will, just like a wish-granting star. And the traveler is also a descender, which is kind of like a fallen star, a star that has descended. And not to change the subject, but let's pop over to Star Rail for a second and take a look at the Grand Theater and the dream world of Penacony, which has a crown on it that reminds me of Paimon's for some reason. Now, it may look like a floating castle, kind of like Celestia, but in real space, its true form is actually that of a stellaron, which is really just a wish-granting star. But believe it or not, it's the stellaron that actually stabilizes and maintains the entire dreamscape of Penacony. But to maintain this stability, it eats away at the spirits of the people in the dream. Now, you want to hear something funny? We've seen this exact thing happen in Genshin. In Chapter 3, we got trapped in a shared dreamscape that had been generated by the Akasha system. And in case you forgot, the Akasha was a dream harvesting machine that was created by Rukkhadevata, who is the avatar of Irminsul. And remember, Irminsul in the current theory is basically the embodiment of order within the dream. It maintains its stability. Now, after going through the same dream a few times, the traveler finally ventures out of its borders. And there, the traveler witnesses countless impossible surreal spaces that can only be likened to dreamscapes. Many of the spaces are empty, like they've been consumed, while others only contain mute puppets that look like they should have been real people but aren't. Like, they've had their soul sucked out of them or something. And then the traveler says that the spaces have been disappearing one by one, absorbed by something that looks like a sun in the sky, like the sun is harvesting power in order to fuel the dreamscape. Now, for the record, a sun is a star, which means that this Akasha dreamscape was a lot like Penacony. Both had stars that were feeding off the dreams of the people trapped within their dreamscapes, and the Akasha is kind of like a mini Irminsul in terms of known functionality, which makes sense if it was built by the avatar of Irminsul. Now, in Penacony, the combination of the Dream Master's will and the Stellaron's power allowed him to control the dream world. And when it comes to the Akasha's dreamscape, well, that required the Akasha, the equivalent of the Stellaron, plus Nilou, whose will shaped the direction of the dream. Both of them had a star and someone who's dreaming. Now, the best part of these two stories paralleling each other is that they both end in a somewhat similar way. Nilou uses her control over the dream to return everyone to reality, but Penacony's Dream Master, on the other hand, tried to trick people into believing the dream world was reality, and in doing so ended up somehow blending the dream world into reality. Do you see the common thread? Dreams shifting into reality? Because that's what I think's going to happen with Teyvat. But you might be wondering, why would someone want to do that in the first place? And to that, I would like to direct your attention to the name of Genshin's featured planet, Teyvat. Teyvat is a very odd choice for the name of a planet. It's an old Hebrew word meaning box or chest that contains stuff, but it also gets used in a far more relevant context here, as a reference to Noah's Ark. Teyvat Noah is a biblical Hebrew term used to refer to that infamous boat that allowed the remnants of life on Earth to survive the heavenly floodwaters that were supposed to wipe the world clean of sin. Now, a fun fact about this, the Book of Enoch explains that one of the reasons for the flood was to destroy the Nephilim, half angel, half human giants. Now is not the time to get into this, but in the book The Little Witch and the Undying Fire, we learn that the Nephilim were actually the dominant race in Teyvat at one time. So it's relevant, and I brought it up before in this video, but we'll have to save the deep dive for another time. Now, Noah's Ark gets referenced several times in the book Before Sun and Moon, which contains the only Genesis myth we currently have for Teyvat, which is fitting because the book of Genesis is also where the story of Noah's Ark is. So this Genesis tale basically says that the Primordial One defeated the dragons that ruled the planet, then recreated the world so humans could live there, intending for the world to one day hatch like an egg. Now, what would happen if we took this story a little bit literally? What if Teyvat is the Ark, and the Primordial One is Noah? Noah's job was to preserve life until it was time to restore the world, which means that should also be the job of the Primordial One. And if this Ark is a dream bubble, then the hatching of the egg might be suggesting that the dream will one day become real. But remember, the purpose of the Ark was to preserve life that already existed, not to create new life. So we must consider the possibility that Teyvat used to be a normal planet in the real world, in real space, and it went by another name. And it's also possible that that planet happened to be the one that the traveling twins were originally from, the one that they survived the destruction of. This planet would have sunk into the Sea of Consciousness, which is very analogous to the whole floodwaters thing. Now imagine that after the world's destruction, the only thing that was left of the planet was its prima materia, its Memoria, which sunk into the abyss. This Sea of Consciousness, which would tie into the whole floodwaters thing. In order to prevent the planet's memories from being lost forever, the Primordial One would have had to dive into the abyss and try to bubble those memories, thus creating an ark. Remember that in the bedtime story Archon quest, the twin says that they always wanted to find that field of flowers from their homeland. This field from the Travail trailer, actually. And those flowers? Those are Teyvats, which are native to Conria, and Conria is likely home to the Nephilim, the original dominant race, a theory that I pitched in this video analyzing Arlecchino's Crimson Moon bloodline. And what did the twins see at the end of their journey? That same sea of flowers, or maybe a memory of that sea of flowers preserved within this ark bubble. This would mean that Teyvat is their homeworld, or rather a reimagination of it, and we're going to come back to this idea. So after the Memoria was bubbled, manifestations of nature began to develop their own sentience and took the shape of dragons. Because remember, this is a dream. There aren't really any laws. If nature wants to turn itself into a dragon, it can. But the Primordial One needed to gain dominance over these forces of nature in order to have total control over the dream world. But the dragons themselves fought back, even going so far as to try to shake the stability of the dream by seizing disordered Memoria from the outside. But in the end, they were forced to submit to the being with the superior will, the Primordial One. And why is the will so important? Because the will controls the order of the world. That should make the Primordial One the first descender, since their will is equal to the world. That is in line with Nahida's hypothesis, too. So with total authority in hand, the Primordial One set about trying to restore the planet's memory because, as we previously established, dreams are distorted collections of memories. So Teyvat was likely pretty jumbled up, given that the Primordial One had to completely terraform the planet and redesign all forms of life. This could account for a lot of weirdness in Teyvat, like how some animals have the wrong number of legs. No, I will not let that go. It's really, really, really annoying. This process of restoring the world leveraged the power of Irminsul, which mimicked the functions of the theoretical golden tree from real space, and allowed the Primordial One to impose laws like time, space, life, death, and gravity. Incidentally, Deshret claims that the first thing the Primordial One did was establish the concept of weight, which is basically gravity, and this also implies that gravity did not exist when they first arrived in the dream. I find that very thematically fitting because when we first enter Penacony and Star Rail, we also don't understand the concept of weight and kind of end up flying and entering a freefall state instead. The goal here was to slowly restart life on the planet, and once the world was finished, the Primordial One would slowly merge the dream bubble back into the real world. Using the power of their will and Irminsul. Everything was going to plan and humanity had been reestablished on Teyvat, and then the membrane of the dream bubble, aka the firmament, was breached by invaders who brought with them delusions that could, quote, break the shackles of the world. To me, that sounds a lot like the disordered Memoria coming from the abyss outside of the dream. This invasion destroyed the Primordial One's ability to control the dream properly, so they chopped up the third descender and distributed their remains in the form of the Gnosis among the 7 winners of the following Archon War. A descender's most powerful asset is their will, so this meant that the third descender's will was split into 7 pieces. Now, if the fourth descender, the Traveler, identifies as a star, and a star was harvesting the dreams in the Akasha, and a star was also harvesting people's souls in Penacony, why couldn't these 7 fragments be a star that's harvesting the people's faith? Because not only do Archons like Nahida and Venti claim that Archons and Celestia get their power from the people's faith, but Nouvelette's character story suggests that Archons grant fragments of their mastery in the form of visions in order to receive a greater gift in return. Now, I have nothing to back up this hypothesis, but I think that visions would have first appeared around the time of the Archon War because they were marking those who had the strongest wills, which would then be harvested to power the dream of Teyvat alongside the rest of the people's faith. After all, visions are manifestations of one's ambitions, and what is an ambition but a will to accomplish something? So whatever they did stabilized the dream for a long time until the Cataclysm 500 years ago, which would have happened shortly after Conria summoned the twins from outside of the memory zone and the dream of Teyvat, something that we also saw happen in Penacony towards the end. Now, I think that the Cataclysm damaged the world so badly that the Primordial One was forced to power the dream themselves, and can therefore no longer accomplish their original goal of making the dream manifest in reality, but instead can only sustain the dream in its current state. And that's why the Abyss Twin says that Celestia has been silent ever since the Cataclysm. They're sleeping. As to why Conria summoned the twins at all, and allegedly caused this cataclysm, well, Conria is built in a location where lots of things leak in from the outside, which sounds like they're near some kind of fracture in the dream's membrane. In fact, Conria might exist outside the main dream altogether, or along Irminsul's roots, since those roots stretch into the abyss. And we do have records of a kingdom being established along the roots of Irminsul. Now, I think this means that Conria exists outside of the main dream. This might be why Conria is described as having, quote, those who dream of dreaming, because they live outside of the stable dream. They've also caught glimpses of the truth of this world, the reality that exists just beyond the false sky, the world outside of the bubble. Now, I say this because when the Dream Master took over Penacony's dream and created a false reality, some people with strong wills were able to realize that everything around them was fake, and they woke up. This left them in some sort of borderland, stuck somewhere between reality and the dream. From here, they could peer beyond the so-called sky and see reality on the other side. I think this is similar to what's happening with Conria. That's why Conria is full of those who dream of dreaming. They're trapped in a dream world but unable to join the main dream because they know it's not real. And it also means that they exist outside of the ordered time established by Celestia. That means they could potentially enter the dream of Teyvat at any point in its timeline that they wanted. And that could solve a lot of the timeline weirdness regarding Arlecchino and Kaya's arrival in Teyvat, as well as why Guizhong was able to study ruin guards over 3,000 years before they actually appeared with the Cataclysm. You can also extend this concept to the Abyss portals that the Abyss Order uses. If you open a rift, you can enter a dimension outside of time and space, and then open another rift that will not only let you enter a different space or location, but also at a different point in time. It's not too dissimilar to A's second story quest, where she experienced time differently from everyone else. She was in a chaotic dimension. It's also likely similar to the so-called chaotic space in the chasm during the Perilous Trail quest. Time and space were very messed up there as well. It's even similar to Child's experience of falling into the abyss as a kid, where only a couple days passed in Teyvat, but like 3 whole months passed for him. These are all instances of people entering areas where the laws of time and space start to break down. Now, there's one last thing I've intentionally not mentioned for fear of causing confusion, and that is the means by which the dream of Teyvat, this arc, becomes real. So in Star Rail, real space is known as the realm of the imaginary. The cosmic tree that represents real space is even called the imaginary tree. I think it's very easy to conflate imagination with dreams, but there is one fundamental difference. You dream of things when you sleep, and you imagine things when you're awake. When you extrapolate this difference, you'll start to realize that dreaming is involuntary, subconscious. You don't really have much control over the dream at all. But your imagination is totally voluntary. You have complete control. You can enforce your own will over your own thoughts. So having a dream that you can consciously control is like lucid dreaming, which I guess is what Teyvat should be. Also, generally speaking, you dream at night and you're awake during the day, so the moon is associated with dreams while the sun is associated with the waking world, with reality. Now, in the book Before Sun and Moon, the Primordial One is likened to Phanes, who is a Greek deity of light, the light bringer, which implies that the Primordial One is the metaphorical son of Teyvat, and I think that gives them one very important and very specific ability. The ability to imagine the dream in the real world, to remember it. Think about it like this. The imaginary tree grows from a sea of consciousness, meaning the thoughts of the sea are becoming the things of the tree through the power of imagination, will, and reason. The tree is the will of the universe. It's creating things by defining them, applying order to the chaos. And this is the very specific power that I believe Descenders have. If their will is equal to that of a world, then that may mean that they have the imagination capable of recreating an entire dream world in reality. After all, the person that owns the dream, the one who witnesses it, is the only one that can remember it when they wake up. So the reason that Conria summoned the twins was because they needed this power of will and imagination. They knew that only a power from beyond this world, from beyond this dream, could save them from being eroded away by the chaotic sea of consciousness outside of the dream bubble. Now, perhaps the sinners had lost faith in the Descenders, and they are instead trying to figure out how to brute force their way into reality through other means, like alchemy, while others, like the Abyss Order, try to manufacture a tool, like a new Loom of Fate, that can mimic the power of the imaginary tree from real space and do the deed for them. And perhaps the Fatui are collecting the Gnosis, which are the remains of the third Descender, for the same reasons, to leverage that power of imagination. Heck, maybe even Celestia gave the Gnosis to the Archons in the first place because it was the only way to stabilize the dream by redistributing the will of the world. But all of these are futile endeavors, and Dainsleif probably knows that. I think the woman that he wants to save at the end of the Travail trailer is the one who is sustaining the dream. If the Traveler can defeat him, then they'll have earned the right to seize the throne of heaven and reweave the threads of fate. Because recreating a dream in the real world is something you don't want to screw up. You only really get one shot at it. But this whole going from a sleep state to a wake state, from dream to reality, is probably why at the end of Travail, night turns into day as the Traveler wakes up from the dream, and the dream continues to persist into daytime.
Waking world, you seem woven from the stuff of dreams.
This was one of those theories that made perfect sense in my head, but was very difficult to articulate with words. There's so much left unaddressed, but I kind of like leaving some things open and unanswered. A lot of you really like to take the threads I lay out and just run with it, and you go in some cool places, and I love reading those. Plus, I have this sneaking suspicion that a lot of what I've laid out here will get addressed in Natlan. See, Hoyoverse uses both Liben and Yaemiko's birthday social post to foreshadow events from the upcoming region, and despite knowing that we're going to Natlan, neither of them really mention it, or anything that sounds like you would find in a nation of war. Liben instead talks about falling into a deep hole and staring up at the stars, while Miko's birthday post references dreams outright. If you couple this with the name card that released this patch alongside the Imaginarium Theater that talks about dream worlds, suddenly Natlan seems like a place where the truth starts to leak out, especially since they have a deep connection to the dragons who have evolved over time. Now, earlier in this theory, I did propose the idea that the dragons of Teyvat were literally manifestations of the world itself, like the forces of nature personified. And part of me wonders if that means that they will cease to exist if Teyvat returns to real space. That could have been part of the reason that the dragons actually wanted to fight Celestia in the first place, because Celestia's plan would result in their loss of life, or at least loss of consciousness. But I wonder then, if Saurians have undergone evolution that will allow them to become real, like a dragon dinosaur type of thing. I think I'm gonna leave things there for now. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and an additional tip of the hat to my lovely channel members who somehow believe supporting my nonsense is a good idea. You guys are weird but awesome, so take care of yourselves out there, and I'm gonna see you all in the next one.